Mike Brady from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. So what we'll do is they've got slides that they're going to share. We will go through their talks that'll run about 15 minutes or so. And I think what we'll do is we'll hold all questions until after the second talk so that we can have a discussion that will hopefully sort of combine elements of both of those. Without any further ado, Mark, why don't you start?
Okay, actually, I think we set it up. Mike was going to lead off.
I must have an old agenda. All right, Mike will go.
Okay. Okay, you got it.
All right.
Thank you. Full screen here. Great, thanks. Okay, thank you for that introduction, William. I'm Mike Brady. I'm a cartographer in the Maritime Safety Office at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And I'm going to start by thanking the IARPIC Arctic Observing Sub-Team for organizing this meeting and for providing the opportunity to present. So today I'm going to provide a very high-level overview of my recent dissertation work, where I mapped coastal risks in collaboration with local communities on Alaska's North Slope. And then I want to end by suggesting a few ways that that this work contributes to societal benefit areas and IARPIC performance elements for discussion. So I think this group would be familiar with what's going on in the Arctic. We have declining sea ice and permafrost and other changes that are having major environmental impacts in the Arctic region. One of them is exacerbating already extreme erosion along Alaska's northern coastline. And my dissertation research was focused on understanding the impacts on the remote Arctic local communities that live along that remote stretch of coastline at the top of Alaska. So we do have some knowledge about the coastal risks up there, but our focus tends to center on where the people live. So where the buildings are, where the utilities are. And while these risks are very important, I don't want to underplay that. It's not the whole story. So early on in my research, I did some preliminary field work on the North Slope, and through speaking with local community members, I quickly learned that the risks extend across that vast coastline. So it's not just focused on the village centers. So especially when you consider other certain land uses like subsistence hunting. Those land uses are very important to local communities, and they are impacted by erosion effects. I decided for my dissertation research to go out and systematically collect local perceptions of coastal risk. And then I worked with the local government there to kind of package those local observations in a way that it could be used by the land use managers to support their land use decisions and plans. So here on the right, these are some erosion risks that are happening outside of the villages that some here may be familiar with. So here we have a Department of Defense early warning radar site. This is legacy infrastructure, but may still have some value and repurpose later on. Those are, the high erosion rates occurring at these radar sites. And then this is an example of a hunting camp that's been lost to sea. It's a food security issue related to erosion. So this map, this shows some of the land uses on the North Slope of Alaska. And I don't have time to get into all of this, a very complex land use situation there. But the takeaway here is there's a lot of land uses occurring outside of the village centers, which are identified in this map as these black dots. For example, this hashed area is the collective subsistence area for all of the communities. So this coastline is being used for subsistence activity all across this vast area. And also, so in brown and gold here, these are for-profit Alaska Native claims. And some of them, are experiencing high erosion risks. One important one is this Cape Halkett area here, where the regional corporation is trying to develop, but they can't get approval because the erosion is thought to be so bad there. And just for some orientation, this gray line here, this is the boundary of the North Slope Borough. This is the largest and most northern municipality in the United States. It's Alaska controlled. The Alaska Natives established it in the early 70s to be able to tax the oil and gas activity that was centered around the Prudhoe Bay area. And those revenues then allowed the borough to provide municipal services or support municipal services in the villages. And again, the take home here is there's land use happening outside of those village centers. So presumably we're going to see some risks, and you can understand them better if you talk to the people that live there and see them daily. So this map shows my study area. These are the 3 villages that I worked in. Wainwright, Utqiagvik, and Koktovik. So what you can see here is these are the traditional land use extents. And something I want to point out is the 2 coastlines of interest were the National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska, and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I wanted to make sure I covered this stretch of coastline because this is where important land use decisions are occurring to try to balance subsistence and oil and gas development. So to collect local perceptions of coastal risks, I did community mapping workshops in the 3 villages. So what you're seeing here is a map. These red dots here all indicate where a participant placed a coded sticker of some erosion problem and then either verbally told me or wrote down what the issue was. And I've attached those to these locations. I've digitized all the information in GIS. So these red dots are sticker points, and I've got attributes that include those narratives. So these are sort of the geo-narratives of the problems all along the coastline. And so I've got this database, participants associated with each of these points and the issue that's happened there with erosion. So I had about 50 people participate in these workshops, and told they provided around 300 locations where there's some kind of erosion issue. And something I want to mention here is, I'm not just collecting data when I'm doing these workshops. This is also like a great social event. This is a way to network, meet people. So I'm also establishing networks in the process to potentially, in the future, have access to information like this as needed. So I can't go through all the 300 risks that we've identified, but one kind of appropriate one, I think, that illustrates some of the risks to not only the subsistence hunting, but also industrial development. So what we're looking at here is a legacy distant early warning radar site that has been repurposed and kind of taken over by the North Slope Borough to help kind of centralize oil and gas exploration in the National Petroleum Reserve. So the idea is if the borough can help encourage the use of this piece of land, they can mitigate the risk to surrounding lands that are sensitive subsistence areas, so used for hunting. Some of the land use managers mentioned that this site is eroding, they're losing access to the airstrip and some other infrastructure, and they don't know what to do with it. They don't know whether or not they should invest in it to fortify it, to adapt it to the changes, or if they should, in the long term, plan on abandoning it. And they said, we just don't have the environmental information to support a decision either way. This is one example. So I want to mention that this collaborative mapping, this community mapping work is part of a larger co-production model to create coastal risk information in collaboration with the North Slope Borough and its residents. So this was a formal collaboration with the North Slope Borough. And I'm not gonna, there's a lot of details here. I'm not gonna go into too much depth, but I did want to give you some sense of what I did here. Each of these steps, 1, 2, 3, these all involve detailed data collection analysis methods I don't have time to get into. If there's interest in them, I can describe them in more detail in a future meeting. But what I'll do is just kind of step through this to give you an idea of the co-production model. So I did this collaborative step 1. This is that community mapping, and also collecting existing asset data of kind of assets located all along the coastline. And then what I did is I made a shoreline change susceptibility data model, which is based on US Geological Survey data. I kind of adapted their transects and added additional environmental information such as distance to sea ice. And I took that environmental data, integrated it with this asset data to create a coastal exposure model, coastal erosion exposure model. So with that data, I worked with, I had a desk at the GIS office in North Slope Borough, and I worked with the local GIS staff to create a module, a coastal risk module to put on the web mapping portal that's used internally by the borough for land use planning. And then we were able to use that to support usability workshops in this third step with local managers to get information on how we can improve the system. So the idea is, these solid arrows, this is the general direction of the work, how things should progress, not always linear. And the dotted arrows, this is opportunities for the local community and the managers to provide feedback to co-produce the product to make sure it's useful. The idea is this is a sustained process. So over time, you'll hopefully start realizing some societal impacts. Maybe a land use decision is supported. So again, I can't get detail here in the methods, but the point is I developed a structured way to interact with these local communities to generate coastal risk information. And I believe that this structure, the sustained interaction, presents an opportunity to connect those local communities with the wider Arctic Observing Network activities to hopefully address some of these erosion risks and maybe address other environmental problems as this model evolves. So give you a little window into this GIS, very, very beta in terms of development, but the way it works is we have these 50-meter transects the U.S. Geological Survey created. I added some value by providing some additional environmental information. I apologize, you can't really see the text here, but this is environmental information that is queried by selecting a transect. So you can select any of these transects to bring up that environmental information, or you can select an asset to bring up the information where the closest transect is. So this is just an example of a hunting camp that's eroding. So you can query by asset or zoom into a transect or a region of interest, start poking around and see what the erosion situation or susceptibility to erosion is. Okay, so this can be thought of, this community mapping work, this web mapping work with the North Slope Borough can be thought of as kind of a grassroots, bottom-up observing network. So the next step that I started working on in the dissertation was to think about how that grassroots effort can connect to the wider observing network community. So this we're looking at as an illustration of how I started to think about how to make those connections. So here we have the North Slope Borough GIS portal. Again, this is an internal system used by the borough, and then we have this coastal erosion module that we created together. And what you're looking at here are just some of the organizations that provided the data, or in some way were connected with this portal, this GIS portal. So these are the organizations at the top here that provided some of the asset data that were included in that model. Below here are some of the organizations that provided the environmental information that were integrated into that system. And then to the left, ILOCA, this is an organization that is a steward of local ecological knowledge. And this is not an established connection, but the plan, the thought was I would connect with them to help me manage some of this, in some cases, sensitive local knowledge to responsibly share it with entities like the North Slope Borough and potentially others as a way to control the dissemination and also maintain the trust of your participants in the process to keep this a sustained interaction. And then below here, the left, we have Polar Geospatial Center. Again, this is hypothetical connection, but the Polar Geospatial Center, the National Geospatial Center, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the National Science Foundation and others collaborated to create an Arctic digital elevation model. And as this develops, the idea is it might be dynamic and a good input to be able to update some of these, the shoreline change happening in remote places like the North Slope. And then to the right here, this is the Arctic Data Center. This is a way I started to store some of the data products in some form to get it out to the broader research community. So again, this is just kind of me brainstorming on how this can start connecting to create to connect with the wider observing network community. So this is another depiction of that attempt. I know there's a lot going on here, but this model is used by the Arctic Observing Network community to start making connections between observations and societal benefit areas. I was asked to fill this out to submit to the Arctic Observing Summit in Davos recently, a year ago. And this is what I came up thinking about how this effort connects to those societal benefit areas and other Arctic Observing Network connections. So I'll just kind of briefly mention what's going on here. So in the middle, we have an application that we developed, the North Slope Borough Coastal GIS. The idea is, well, we have some end users that have access to that portal that would use it for some purposes. For example, the North Slope Borough could use it to support land use decisions. And then the idea is through use of that, you might realize some societal benefits. One of them I'll mention later is disaster preparedness. That's one that I've identified as a potential benefit from providing access to coastal risk information. To the right of that application is a phenomena. So these are the variables that we used so far in that portal. So obviously environmental variables, but also include land use. So the environmental variables and the land use together are, create the outcome of coastal exposure. So those are the variables that we included in that GIS. And that's evolving. That's, we can expand on that. And then to the right, we have products. These are data products that are used to create those variables. And then all the way to the right here, these are the observing systems that make all this possible. So I'm going to point out, obviously we have satellite imagery, but also I've included local and other stakeholder observations as part of this observing system. So clearly there's a lot of work going from observations to creating a portal to hopefully getting some societal impacts that benefit society. A lot of work to be done. I see this GIS portal development as just being the facilitator of that process, being the boundary object of that whole process to facilitate communication and other interaction. So to end, I wanted to kind of present some ideas for discussion on how this work connects with societal benefit areas. One obvious one is disaster preparedness, and also how this connects with IARPIC performance elements. So first off, disaster preparedness, clearly providing coastal exposure information to land use managers. That's providing access to disaster-related intelligence that can support land use decision-making. So this benefit area is all about access to disaster-related environmental intelligence. And here I want to also mention the multiple uses concept. So, that supports Arctic maritime domain awareness. That same information about, the same local knowledge about the coastline is vital to effective oil spill response. So as a former Coast Guard member who's responded to plenty of oil spills, I can tell you that you're not going to do much without local knowledge, especially in a remote place like this. So when you're in a helicopter doing an overflight survey of impacted areas, trying to figure out how to prioritize your assets, you need a local in that helicopter to help you, know where you're looking, to be able to connect with where you're looking on a map, figure out if you can access an important sensitive lagoon that's been impacted to put out boom to protect it. You need to know if you can get a boat in there. Sometimes only one in a place like this, one person might be the person that's the only one that knows what's going on, what the update is with that particular stretch of coastline. Also, refuge areas. Before you send out assets, you want to know if there are any persistent cuts in the barrier island where you can seek shelter during a storm. These are things that come up in a harsh place like the Arctic. Clearly there are other kind of benefits that local knowledge can provide, but again, the data that I created and also the social networking provides information that can be useful for other Arctic maritime domain awareness purposes. As far as performance elements, 9.1 is an obvious one, enhanced participation to make the Arctic observing process more inclusive. What I'm talking about here is potentially including local communities in that process, using that sustained interaction, that structured interaction to structure the data in a way that it can be communicated to the broader observing community, Arctic observing organizing communities like the Sustained Arctic Observing Network or SAON. I'll end with a question I have for the audience. Something I'd really like to hear from others is the ways they see the value of engaging local communities in their work, whether it be for their science to access, get better access to sites, or to get local observations that help their science, or other purposes like their agency's mission. And also, I'd like to hear from others if they have ideas about, based on what they were able to get out of this presentation, what this collaborative mapping process, what other applications it can be used for. So, maybe not just coastal erosion, other applications, other stakeholders that can be involved in that process. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mike. That certainly gives us some questions to lead in, and we have a general discussion at the end here. As I said at the beginning, I think we're going to hold questions until after we've heard from the next presentation, which is by Mark Ivey. So you're all set, Mark. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, can you see my slides okay and hear me?
Yeah, it's good.
Looks great, Mark.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Ivey. I'm talking to you from Sandia Labs in Albuquerque, New Mexico today. I'm in the Atmospheric Sciences Department at Sandia, and I manage North Slope facilities for the DOE ARM program that Sally McFarlane manages. So today I want to focus on sort of a idea of dual use for our Arctic observations that might serve both science and security purposes. Let's see. Okay. Okay, you might wonder why somebody talking to you from the high desert of New Mexico is telling you about work in the Arctic. It turns out we've been supporting DOE, the ARM facilities on the North Slope for about 20 years now, the oldest one in Barrow. I'll show you some photos in a minute. And then we've also done, across other departments at Sandia, done work for Alaska Native villages on energy assessments, work for the Department of Defense in Alaska, and also done a bit of work down in Antarctica with using synthetic aperture radars. So on the North Slope for the DOE ARM program, we manage 3 facilities, 2 of which are active right now. One is in standby mode. The principal facility is Utqiagvik, Barrow. We've been there for 20 years delivering atmospheric information, atmospheric observations we take on a 24/7, 365 basis there. We also have a facility about 170 miles to the southeast at Aliktok Point, Alaska, and I'll show you some more maps of that and information. That facility is different than Barrow because it has a road to it from the lower 48, and there's also special use airspace where we can close off the airspace to other traffic and do things like put balloons inside clouds, which would normally present a hazard to air traffic up there. And then we have a third facility at Atkusuk, which is about 60 miles south of Utqiagvik. That facility's in a standby mode there, but we still use it for field campaigns. So I want to mention an event that Sandia helped to sponsor at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. back in September. We talked about this idea of dual use security and science observations. And I'll just say that there's a final report that's going to be released in about a week. We're hearing before the end of April for sure. And I think with some help from Kelly, we can get a pointer to that posted somewhere, or you can contact me. So I want to just go through some examples of this dual use idea where we're taking observations that principally funded through the science part of the security part of things, but can be used for both. So the ARM site in Barrow includes an X-band radar, and that's the kind of radar you typically see on TV showing you where the rain is falling. But we have one of those on one of the highest buildings in Utqiagvik. And it turns out it does a great job of seeing clouds and precipitation, but it also can monitor sea ice. So it's a great tool for Arctic awareness. We've talked to Hayo Aiken and others at UAF about this. And it's been a learning experience for us because when you open up this dual use, you engage another set of users and your priorities can shift a bit in terms of keep making resources available to keep these things running. The next one on my list is going the other way from the DOE Department of Defense back to the science side of things. But it turns out that the Air Force still keeps a set of radar stations running on the North Slope of Alaska. And part of the feed goes to the FAA. And we're able now to tap into that and watch air traffic in almost real time And that's really great for when you're trying to fly balloons or fly unmanned aircraft for science purposes. It helps us keep things safe and builds the case to do that, in fact, with the FAA. Then we operate balloon sounding systems and unmanned aerial systems and tethered balloon systems for various purposes, but those all have this dual use scientific plus possible security applications. One I'll mention in particular, you see the photo to the right. The little aircraft you see out the window is the mid-size Sea Hunter unmanned aircraft flying north. It flew quite a distance north of Aliktok Point. And this is another example of that dual use. In fact, with the information from the radar station, we think that unmanned aircraft can now fly unescorted north of Aliktok. And there are a couple other instances here. We're working with the Coast Guard. We've worked with them a number of times. And I'll show you some photos of that in a minute. So after being up there now for a while, we think there's value in thinking about a permanent installation up there somewhere on the North Slope. We're not sure where. Something similar in ways to the Toolik Lake installation, or maybe in some ways like South Pole, where you'd have facilities where researchers could come up and multiple agencies would be able to use it. And so we're exploring that. We're trying to get a workshop together with National Academy of Sciences maybe later this year, just to talk about what capabilities and features a camp like that might have and where it might be. One metaphor that's really appealing is maybe this is a string of pearls, that there are a series of sites along the North Slope, each with different advantages and capabilities depending on the mission. And then this is one location we've been scouting. It's a possible place for this multi-agency camp, close to the Arctic Ocean, connected to the road to the lower 48, good communications. This is not the only one we're looking at, but it's one possibility. So yeah, so let me go on real quick. This is an idea that turned out to be pretty useful. We found some internal money at Sandia, and we brought about 50 researchers together who had some experience in the security side of things, and talked about observations and work we could do on the North Slope that related to Arctic security and to science. And we collected ideas and distilled those down to about 3 or 4 LDRDs that are moving forward. One of them is a new erosion model for the coast, and another one is a sea ice model we're working on. So I'll just talk about this for a minute and tell you why this turned out to be a cool, very cool, literally, I guess, interaction with the Coast Guard. The idea, and Mike mentioned this, if there's a maritime accident in the Arctic, search and rescue is going to be a big question, and response is going to be a big question. So the Coast Guard does these exercises roughly once a year. And this one focused on using an unmanned aircraft to do the initial search and rescue, flying the pattern, looking for, in this case, they were looking for a life raft with a thermal source in it. The UAV spotted the thermal source, and then the manned helicopter took off out of Dead Horse and flew out and dropped the swimmer in the water. One of the key ideas or points here is the helicopter only has enough fuel to linger over the site for maybe 5 minutes. So you really need to know exactly where you're going before you head out there. So I just want to close with a couple of takeaways. One is we found after 20 years of working in Utqiagvik, it's really expensive and really difficult to work in the Arctic compared to the lower 48. And the one example I would cite, when you go to the grocery store in Utqiagvik, a gallon of milk is $10, and a gallon of orange juice is $10, and you're paying for air freight basically. So sharing resources really makes sense, and it allows us to do more science with our budget. As Mike mentioned, we have also found community support is essential to success. Now, what community means depends on where you are. If you're in Utqiagvik, it means the Native Corporation, or it could mean the North Slope Borough. In Prudhoe Bay, it means oil companies, and it means oil service companies, and in our case, it also means the Air Force. And finally, I'll say that some of these examples I showed are really intended to give you a flavor for what kinds of things are possible, and they sort of, for us, have laid down a foundation for observational opportunities we hope to open up. I'll close in that vein. I'll close with a note that we're trying to put together a session at the AGU fall meeting in December in San Francisco to talk about Arctic observations and facilities. So that's it.
Okay, thanks, Mark. That was great. So I think now there are a lot of people on, and both Mike and Mark sort of posed questions. I think at this stage, I'll ask Sally if she wants to add anything, but I had thought just to open it up to general discussion.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I know Renee Tatusko had a comment in the chat on Mike's presentation, so maybe you want to start with her.
And then I'll put my hand up. This is Lil.
Okay, well, why don't we'll start with Renee, and then we'll move to Lil. How's that?
So this is Renee. So the comment I had made to Mike went to his question about identifying potential other stakeholders is the Alaska Division of Geophysical and Geological Survey, DGGS, as a potential. They are doing map, and I know I see Amy on the on one of the callers here, and I know that DGGS is working with some of the Western communities on providing coastal erosion mapping. So this might be a potential opportunity for Mike as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, that was helpful. Lil, I know you're on the phone, so why don't you go?
Okay, so I'm actually going to throw out a challenge, and I'm actually in the Pacific Northwest right now, working with our colleagues and teams on several aspects of Arctic, monitoring, surveillance, etc. And so I have a challenge for Mike, and is it Mark or is it Mike and Mike?
Mike and Mark.
Mike and Mark. So couple of things. We often have folks who've been involved in the Arctic, and they will, your comments are well met. Things are expensive. It's expensive to do things. We got to work with communities. We got it. It's all really important stuff, and very glad to hear it again. But the challenge is, we are all talking about observing for, security and science. The security of what? What is the common goal? And there are so many layers of redundancy at this point. Where is the science of the integration or the leveraging of all the efforts that have taken place already, so that we have a benchmark to work toward a goal? Because what I don't hear is, what is the problem? What are we tackling? What are the goals? And how are we going to do it with what we have before we start building out more?
Well, that's a provocative question, so I would open it up to anybody. Maybe Mike and Mark want to respond first.
I suspect that my answer is going to be a bit simpler, so I'll go first. So great points, and this is actually another aspect of what you're saying is a problem working in these communities. They're frustrated. They say, this is something. So there's a lot of overlap in research. What I was doing was very similar to what others are doing. So you get this, researcher burning out the community. They're kind of frustrated, and they kind of see lots of redundancy. So it's a very good point. This is something that was challenging for me to navigate, to try to figure out what was my value added. there. So my answer really, and this is kind of a philosophy that I started to live by, not only for that reason, but the reason why I did the kind of research I did was I wanted to let the community tell me what kind of research should be done, to have them drive the questions. So I was fortunate enough when I started the research, I really didn't have great questions going in. I just was able to just kind of hang out and talk to people and let them tell me what they think, which helped me shape my research. And that actually worked out. So I ended up getting a letter from the borough saying, we like it. We like that you're letting us participate in the questions that you're going to ask, because it's going to be useful to us. So that, to answer your question, I think, and this is an ongoing process, is we need to ask the participants in our studies what the security mean to them. And what I found was, when we're talking about erosion, it's not just the utilities, the life property protection systems. It's also things that they value, like traditional land use spaces. They're losing important hunting grounds, community spaces.
Oh, okay.
That's what it means to them.
Okay, I guess I got it, and I'm sorry. What are we trying to fix? What's broken? What are we trying to fix? This to me is the status quo, and I think it's wonderful. And I know you and I have crossed paths before, but we have limited resources, and we have a lot of challenges that are coming up that are tied into climate, environmental change, etc. So what are we trying to fix?
Well, societal benefit area disaster preparedness, we need more access to environmental intelligence to make better decisions. And I think that's just the multifaceted process, and we're just in the early stages of organizing resources and figuring out what that means. In the interim, it's gonna be messy, and that's why I really think having the stakeholders drive the process is really going to be essential. And I'm not sure what else we can do aside from.
So yeah, this is Mark, and I'll give you my take on it and open it to Sally, because I know she has similar views. But in our case, we're there for a very specific purpose. We're really trying to understand what's going on in the atmosphere and how Arctic clouds work, and take that information back and make atmospheric models work a lot better, because we know there are problems, particularly at high resolution scales. And so we're really clear on the observations we want to make and where we want to make them and how long we want to make them. The problem is they're expensive. And to get all the observations we want, we'd like to be in more places. And the other thing that's happened is we've been up there for 20 years, and we've had a lot of people come to us and say, hey, can you help us measure sea ice? Because look, along 1,000 miles of Arctic coastline right now, as far as I know, there's only one station launching weather balloons, and that's us. And if we go away, there's 1,000 miles without weather balloons, which is not a good thing for making weather forecasts and building models. So I think we're here right now, as Mike hinted, as a information sharing process that we all, I think, have different aspirations and goals for what information we'd like to collect. On the security side, it's really a long list. If you talk to Church Key at ADAC or our friends down at UAF, they really want to know a lot more about the sea ice. They want to know a lot more about the atmosphere. So I think the best shot I see at getting this information together for the community is by sharing resources. So Sally, I saw you flash up there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have much to add to that, Mark. I mean, I think from the IARPC Arctic Observing System subteam point, we're trying to get a better understanding of, what the needs are out there, and as people said, what is existing, what do people not know about that we can help make connections. I mean, we're a collaboration team, so our goal is to kind of encourage collaborations, and I think, part of the point of these presentations and trying to bring these different communities together is to encourage those collaborations. So I think we've already seen you know, Renee had a good suggestion about the Alaska DGS. I won't get it right already. So I think that's really a lot about what these seminars are about. I see there's several comments coming up in the chat. I don't know. Let's see. Bill Manley had a question about the erosion portal and whether it's publicly available.
Yeah, that was a, yeah, Mike, that's a really interesting study for sure, linking remote observation with burns and observations. And so is the erosion portal accessible publicly?
No, and this is a great question. So part of the challenge, so the North Slope Borough, they need access to environmental information to make lots of important land decisions. They're hampered. They don't have enough information. And you know, we have lots of portals out there, but they're all on the internet. And currently the North Slope Borough cannot access the internet. So it's interesting. We have these portals being set up to, like, for one reason, for a couple of reasons, for a few, you know, more than one reason, but the idea is it'll also allow locals to have access to the information, but they can't get on the internet. So they've, the North Slope Borough has developed a system on the intranet, so it's internal, but they can access it. But another question, something we've been talking about is how to design it so aspects of it can be pushed up to a publicly accessible version while kind of interacting with that locally usable version. But that's kind of where we left it currently. You know, it's on the North Slope Borough internal portal and cannot be accessed from the outside.
Yeah, and so the borough doesn't have access to the internet. That's odd because it seems like they used to.
Yeah, no, so not reliable access. So this actually came up. We had a usability workshop, and they couldn't get on the internet, so just kind of a wash. But they were able to show you know, the maps that were installed locally. So I mean, they have internet access, but it's unreliable. Then that was my understanding working with the North Slope Borough, is that they just had a hard time accessing anything on the internet.
That's interesting because with the Barrow Area Information Database, and Allison was involved with this as well, we created a coastal erosion viewer in collaboration with the borough, and we tested it with them there in Barrow. And so, I don't know, hopefully it's being still accessed along with the portal you mentioned.
Yeah, I recall that, and you know, some of the frustration was it was difficult to access. So not only access, this is something we could talk about offline. I think it's really at the heart of co-production is they were involved, but in some ways, and this is kind of going back a couple of years at this point, we were having these conversations, they weren't involved in some critical ways that would enhance usability. And you know, your portal, I mean, blows the thing out that we made out of the water. I mean, that thing was incredible, but it was missing some like aspects, including like kind of soft social stuff, like interaction, process, like being involved in the data collection and analysis process, which builds trust. So we can talk about it offline, but there was some interesting insights in that process. But I do remember your portal.
If I can jump in really quickly, this is Sean Moon with DHS, and I'd like to go back, if you guys could, because we've gone off into usability and access and portals. Nobody's ever really addressed Lil's question of what are you talking about when you talk about security? I'd really like to know before a whole bunch of money gets invested in observations.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good security of what? And I think this is something I want to get at.
Who is speaking right now?
This is Mike Brady. If you were online, you could see my face. This is.
Okay, so I'm not online, but thanks.
Yeah, sorry, Mike Brady. So one challenge is trying to connect, you know, environmental security with more traditional senses of security. And I have ideas about how those connections work. Like in the North Slope, national security is tied with energy security. When you think about the importance of the local communities in the long term, really providing sustained access in the region by being stewards of the environment, support sustainable land use, which also enhances access for other land uses like national security. Like the same airstrips that the locals use are you know, could be used for other reasons like a Coast Guard. plane or another national security related asset. So I think that's an important question, and I think we do need to better articulate the kinds of securities we're talking about. And I think until we do so, we're going to be challenged with how to really connect these different observing systems that have different objectives. I think it's an important question. We need to talk about that more.
Well, that might be a topic for a future meeting. That was thank you for bringing that back on point. Are there any other comments along those lines? There are a lot of people online, although we're starting to lose a few people, and we've only heard from a few people. Anybody else want to weigh in here?
This is Paula. I think that one of the issues with answering the question that Lil has asked is that there is no overarching state or federal policy with regard to the Arctic. So it's very difficult to answer that question because there really is not an overarching policy.
Hi, Sean again. I beg to differ. It's called the National Strategy for the Arctic Region. There's a DOD Arctic Roadmap and strategy. There's a Coast Guard strategy. There's significant guidance out there. There are executive orders on it.
So, Sean, do you think those roadmaps and executive orders aren't getting to the research community? Is there a gap here between what you folks at DHS are doing and what the scientific observing community is doing?
I'd have to say that yes, there's a gap, and I don't understand it just simply because these are publicly accessible documents. And when you go to whitehouse.gov, you can find them. Go to Coast Guard USCG mill, and you can find them. Do a Google search for Arctic strategies or what have you. They will pop up. And these are the guidance pieces for what is supposed to happen up there and what the government, the federal side, will do.
So do you think
go ahead.
Do you think the funding agencies, I mean, from a scientific, a civilian point of view, the research is in part driven by the funding agencies. They'll argue that there's bottom up, and to a certain extent, depending on the agency, there is and there isn't. Do you think the funding agencies should be more in tune with these Arctic policies that you just pointed to?
I have to say that they're getting there. Navigating the new Arctic includes security.
So in that case, so did you say that you felt that navigating the Arctic was getting to that, from that direction?
The people who aren't talking, please mute. It's very hard to hear Sean, and I think we have a lot of feedback on the line.
Thanks, Sally.
That's part of your bottom line. There is also some fracturing internal within the government because we have different components doing different things. But that was what the NSAR was supposed to help to address, was to try and unify some of those efforts.
I'm just going to jump in here. This is Sarah from IARPIC, and say that the strategies and executive orders are all on the About page for IARPIC collaborations, and we're integral to producing the plan. So I know that at least from the group of people that have been involved with IARPIC in the development of this plan should be familiar with the integration of that into this plan.
Right, and it's one of the roles of IARPIC to connect across agencies, and particularly with the with the civilian research community. But clearly, I think Sean raises a good point, and it gets back to Lil's question at the beginning, is that there's clearly a disconnect between some of the observing efforts and the policy. And I don't think we're going to solve that in the next 5 minutes, although I think it might be a topic for a future meeting. Does anybody else want to weigh in?
Yes, this is Matt Conover, State Planning Director for Northwest Arctic Borough, and we're just in the South Senior. And I wanted to make sure that you're aware of news reports that there was a Chinese company or the government on contract with the Canadian government laying out acoustic listening systems on the Canadian side, but there should be some international collaboration on that policy that acknowledges the potential for security shortfalls. That's all.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else have any comments on particularly what Sean was saying, or anything else that came up in the two talks?
Well, there's a chat from Renee Tedesco asking if Sean could provide any updates regarding the National Security Council's Arctic policy effort or initiative.
At the moment, the NSC has established an Arctic Security PCC. It has met twice. They are in the process of finalizing, or have just finalized, a new roadmap for federal action from the classified side.
And what's the timeline on that being completed, Sean?
My understanding is that it was in final review and may have even been released as of late last week.
Great, thanks. Anybody else? All right, well, yeah, go ahead.
I'll just point people to the chat because there are several connections being made between other policy documents, both federal and state. So you're there.
Sally, you got anything you want to add? No, all right. Stunned. All right. Well, I'm cognizant of people's time. I think there's, I saw Sarah madly taking notes, and Meredith and Kelly. So I think there's certainly questions, and I think the awareness and security, but really just the start. So I would welcome, and I know Sally and Sandy would welcome any comments to us individually about how we might move this forward. I appreciate everybody's time, particularly, well, everybody's got a lot to do, but I was happy to see so many different agencies calling in and represented today. That's, from my experience on these calls, that's unusual. I think we had a high diversity of agencies today, perhaps the greatest we've ever had. So if anybody doesn't have any other closing comments, I would hope we could, in the future, to advance some more of the things that came up.
Well, if I can throw one in, Sean, again.
Sure.
Just sort of a closer for people to think about when we're talking domain awareness. If we don't know what's going on up there, we may, federal government writ large, DHS, CBP, Coast Guard, et cetera, we can't do homeland security or national defense. So what you guys are doing is important. Getting it right is critical.
Right. Well, that's certainly a challenge for the research community, but I think the challenge also is for the research community to talk to the security community. So I think that's something we can think about going forward, and we might even put that on the agenda. So thank you, Sean, for your comments. Anybody else?
This is Mike Brady. If I can make one a plug. So in November 21 and 22, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is hosting a 2-day symposium on Arctic maritime domain awareness. So we hope to bring in some new perspectives on in an unclassified session there. And I can be in touch with an abstract. We're getting it releasable to the public in the coming weeks. So if maybe Sarah or someone else can help me with the contact list, I can include you in that distribution to keep it on your radar. Thank you.
Yeah, that'd be great. There's a way, Sarah or someone can help you show how to actually put that up on IARPIC. I think that'd be really helpful.
Kelly will reach out to you, Michael, and get that done.
Yeah, we won't let you get away. And thank you, Michael and Mark, for your time putting together those presentations. Anything else?
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I hope this is the start of a good future discussion. Okay, thanks for your time, everybody. And the next meeting is May 15th, I think. And please, stay tuned to this space, because I think we're going to come back and revisit this.
I think the May meeting is a joint with the data sub-team, so it's a little bit of a different focus. But.
Right.
Yeah, and I think our meeting's actually going to be on May 30th, the data sub-team's normal meeting time.
Oh, okay.
All right, I messed up both of those things. All right, well, we will come back and revisit this this topic. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.